My daughter called me 3 weeks before Christmas. I remember staring at my phone for a long time before answering. Her name hadn't appeared on my screen in 6 years. Mom, she said softly like nothing had ever happened. We'd love for you to come for Christmas this year. For a moment, I couldn't speak. 6 years, no holidays, no birthdays, no phone calls that lasted more than a minute. And now suddenly, Christmas, I asked her if she was sure. Of course, she said quickly, it's time, the kids are older now, we want you here. My heart did something I hadn't felt in years, hope, dangerous, quiet hope. I told her yes. When I arrived at her house on Christmas Eve, the lights were already on. Warm yellow glow in every window, a wreath on the door, laughter drifting out from inside. She opened the door before I even knocked. Mom, she said, wrapping her arms around me tightly. It was the kind of hug that pretends nothing ever broke. I hugged her back. I smiled. She smelled the same. Her hair fell the same way over her shoulder. For a second, I let myself believe this was what I'd been missing all along. Inside, the house was perfect. Tree decorated, stockings lined up, presents already stacked underneath. Her husband greeted me politely. The children looked at me with curiosity, not recognition. Say hello to Grandma, my daughter said brightly. They waved. Not one of them stepped forward. That hurt more than I expected. But I said nothing, I smiled. Dinner was loud. Stories, laughter, clinking glasses. My daughter kept touching my arm, asking if I was comfortable, if I needed anything. She played the role perfectly. If someone had walked in, they would have thought we were the closest family in the world. But something felt rehearsed, too careful, too attentive. Every time I tried to talk about the past, she gently redirected the conversation. Let's not dwell on old things, Mom, she said with a smile. Tonight is about being together, so I let it go. I smiled. That night after everyone went to bed, I couldn't sleep. Jet lag, she'd said kindly. You'll probably wake up early. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of every sound. I got up to get some water. That's when I heard voices. Low, careful, coming from the kitchen. I stopped halfway down the stairs. It was my daughter and her husband. She won't suspect anything, he said. There was a pause. She's just happy to be here, my daughter replied. She always is. My hand tightened on the railing. My heart began to pound. She doesn't know how bad things are, he asked. No, my daughter said, and she doesn't need to, not yet. Another pause, then the words that changed everything. We just need to get through Christmas. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. Because in that moment, standing in the dark of my daughter's house, I finally understood something I hadn't wanted to believe. I wasn't there because she missed me. I was there for a reason. And whatever that reason was, I was never meant to hear it. If you're here listening to my story, please like this video and stay with me until the end. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. It helps me see how far this story travels. Because that night, Christmas hadn't even arrived yet, and I already knew something terrible was coming. I should probably tell you who I am so you understand why that invitation meant so much to me. My name is Granny June. I'm 68 years old. For most of my life, I believed in doing things the quiet, steady way. I worked for 32 years as a school administrator. Not a glamorous job, not one that made headlines. But it paid the bills, kept food on the table, and let me sleep at night knowing I'd earned everything I had. I showed up early, stayed late, and took pride in being dependable. I raised my daughter mostly on my own after her father passed away when she was just 11. There was no dramatic inheritance, no safety net. Just a modest house, a used car, and a determination that she would never feel abandoned in this world. I packed lunches, went to parent-teacher conferences, sat through piano recitals and school plays where she searched the audience for my face. And I was always there. When she graduated, I cried harder than anyone in that auditorium. When she got married, I paid for what I could quietly without making a show of it. When her first child was born, I offered help, not advice. I thought that was what love looked like. The distance between us didn't happen all at once. It crept in slowly like fog. Phone calls got shorter, visits got postponed. Then canceled. There's just so much going on, Mom, she'd say. The kids, work, life, you understand. And I did, I always did, until 1 year passed, then 2, then 6. 6 Christmases where I ate dinner alone. 6 birthdays with a quick text instead of a call. 6 years of watching photos of my grandchildren grow up online. I told myself she was busy. I told myself I shouldn't pressure her. I told myself love meant patience. But patience can quietly turn into absence if you're not careful. In those 6 years, I didn't fall apart. I kept my routines, morning walks, volunteering twice a week at the library, coffee with neighbors who noticed when my lights were still off at noon. I downsized my life, but not my dignity. I paid off my mortgage, kept my finances clean, put everything in order the way responsible adults do. Not because I expected anything from my daughter, but because I didn't want to be a burden on anyone. That mattered to me. So when she called and invited me for Christmas, it wasn't just an invitation. It felt like a door reopening. A chance to believe that maybe, just maybe, the distance had been a misunderstanding. That maybe she had grown, softened, remembered. I didn't go there desperate. I went there hopeful. And that's important for you to understand. Because what I walked into that house with wasn't suspicion. It was love. My daughter wasn't always like this. That's the hardest part to explain. When she was younger, she was warm, affectionate. The kind of child who would crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and wrap her arms around my neck like I was the safest place in the world. Even as an adult, she used to call me just to talk, not to ask for anything, not to complain, just to hear my voice. So when people assume our distance came from one big argument or some dramatic falling out, I have to correct them. There was no explosion. There was erosion. The changes started after she married, not immediately, gradually. Her husband was polite, always respectful on the surface, but distant in a way that was hard to describe. He never raised his voice, never criticized me outright. But he had a way of steering conversations, of deciding what was discussed and what quietly disappeared. Whenever I visited, he was busy. Whenever I called, he was working late. And slowly, without ever being announced, I stopped being part of their inner circle. My daughter still smiled, still hugged me, still called me Mom. But something had shifted. Then the children came, 2 of them, and with each birth I was invited a little less. First, I was asked not to stay too long. Then not to give advice, then not to interfere with their routines. Things are different now, my daughter would say gently. We have our own way of doing things. I understood that, I respected it. I backed away because she seemed to want me to. What I didn't understand at the time was how easy it is for distance to become normal. Holidays came and went. Oh, we're traveling this year. We're staying home, just the kids. Next year, Mom. I promise. I never argued, never demanded, never guilt-tripped. I told myself I was being mature, but in hindsight I see it differently. I was being convenient. By the time 6 years had passed, our relationship had been reduced to polite check-ins and filtered updates. I knew what the kids looked like. I didn't know who they were. And my daughter, my only child, had become someone I loved deeply, but no longer fully knew. So when she opened her door that Christmas Eve with that warm hug and that familiar smile, part of me relaxed. I thought maybe this was her way of fixing things. I thought maybe she finally realized how far apart we'd drifted. What I didn't know then was that she hadn't invited me back into her life. She had invited me into a situation. And the version of my daughter I was meeting that Christmas was not the one I remembered. I didn't notice anything wrong right away. That's the thing about patterns, you only see them clearly after you stop pretending everything is fine. The first night after the conversation I wasn't meant to hear, I barely slept. Not because of jet lag, because my mind wouldn't slow down, the words kept replaying. She won't suspect anything. We just need to get through Christmas. I told myself I was misinterpreting it, that I was tired. That couples talk about all sorts of things late at night. So the next morning I watched more closely. At breakfast, my daughter was cheerful, almost too cheerful. She poured my coffee without asking how I liked it. Placed my plate in front of me before I reached for one. You must be exhausted, she said, sitting beside me. Travel is hard at your age. It wasn't unkind, but it landed wrong. I'd traveled alone for years without trouble. She knew that. Still, I smiled. Later that morning, her husband joined us in the living room. He sat across from me, hands folded, studying me in a way that felt professional. So, Mom, he said casually, how's everything been financially? The question hung in the air. I glanced at my daughter. She didn't look surprised. Oh, she's fine, she answered quickly. Very responsible, always has been. Her tone was light. But she didn't look at me when she said it. As the day went on, the questions continued. Small ones, carefully phrased ones. Are you still driving? Do you manage the stairs okay at home? Do you have everything organized legally? They said it like concern. But concern doesn't usually come in inventory form. That afternoon, while the kids were playing upstairs, my daughter sat beside me again. You know, she said softly, we've been thinking a lot about the future. I waited. She continued, at some point it makes sense for families to stick together, to simplify things. Simplify, that word came up more than once. Simplify living arrangements. Simplify responsibilities. Simplify decisions. None of it sounded alarming on its own, but together it felt rehearsed. That evening I noticed something else. My daughter kept her phone close, too close. Whenever I entered a room, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Screens turned face down. Once I caught my son-in-law glancing at his watch, then at me, like we were waiting for something or someone. The worst part? No one asked me what I wanted, not once. Not about Christmas, not about staying longer. Not about my plans. Everything was spoken around me, for me, but never with me. That night, lying in the guest room, I stared at the ceiling and finally admitted the truth to myself. This wasn't reconciliation, it was coordination. And I was the only one who didn't know the full plan yet. The shift happened on Christmas night. Subtle at first, quiet, almost polite. After dinner, after the children were sent upstairs with their new toys, my daughter brought out dessert and set it carefully on the coffee table. She sat across from me instead of beside me this time. Her husband remained standing. That should have been my first warning. Mom, she said gently, folding her hands together, can we talk for a minute? I nodded. Of course I did. We've been thinking a lot about what's best for everyone, she continued. Especially you. There it was again, best for you, her husband finally spoke. We just want to make sure you're protected, he said, as you get older. I waited. You live alone, my daughter added quickly. So far away from us, if something happened, I'm fine, I said calmly. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. That's what worries us, she replied. You always say that? Her husband took a step closer. We've been talking to a financial advisor, he said, and a lawyer. A lawyer, my stomach tightened. Just planning, my daughter rushed to say. Nothing serious. Planning what? They exchanged a look, the kind people exchange when they've already agreed on something. We think it might be time, my daughter said carefully, to make some changes. Changes? I repeated. She nodded. Things like power of attorney. Maybe adding us to your accounts, just in case. Just in case, her husband leaned forward slightly. It would make everything simpler, he said, for everyone. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Why would you need access to my accounts? I asked. The room went quiet. Well, my daughter said slowly, you wouldn't want to burden us with complications later. Burden, I looked at her, really looked at her. This wasn't concern. This was preparation. Then she said the thing that finally crossed the line. If you don't do this willingly, she said softly, we might have to explore other options. What options? I asked. Her husband answered. Guardianship? The word landed like a slap. You don't mean, we just want to be prepared, my daughter interrupted. In case someone questions your judgment. In that moment, everything clicked, the questions, the inventory. The silence at night. They hadn't invited me for Christmas. They had summoned me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply nodded. I understand, I said. They relaxed instantly. My daughter reached for my hand. I knew you would, she said with relief. You've always been reasonable. I smiled, the same way I had since I arrived. But that night, alone in the guest room, I didn't sleep at all, because now I knew the truth. This wasn't about love. It wasn't about family. It was about control. And they thought I was already too old, too grateful, too desperate to resist. They were wrong. I didn't confront them, not that night, not the next morning. I did exactly what they expected me to do. I stayed quiet. At breakfast, I thanked my daughter for hosting Christmas. I complimented the food. I played with the children, laughing at the right moments, keeping my voice soft and agreeable. I let them believe their plan was working. Because sometimes the safest move is to let people think you're unaware. Inside, I was anything but calm. Every word from the night before replayed in my mind with painful clarity. Guardianship. Judgment, other options. They weren't asking for my consent. They were preparing to take it. That morning, my daughter sat across from me at the kitchen table with her phone in hand. We can talk more after the holidays, she said lightly. No rush, because they thought they already had time on their side. Her husband watched me carefully, like someone monitoring a patient's reaction. I smiled. "I appreciate your concern," I said. "I'll think about everything you said." The relief on their faces was immediate. That's when I knew something important. They weren't afraid of me. They thought I was manageable. That afternoon, while they took the kids out to visit friends, I stayed behind. "Rest," my daughter said sweetly. "You must be tired." The door closed behind them, and the house finally went quiet. I sat alone in the guest room and let myself think clearly for the first time, not emotionally, strategically. If they were talking about guardianship, that meant they believed they could prove I wasn't competent, which meant they had already started documenting something: conversations, behaviors, impressions. And if they had spoken to a lawyer, then I needed one too. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a name I hadn't called in years: Elaine Parker, an estate attorney I'd worked with when I paid off my house and updated my will. She'd once told me, "If you ever feel pressured by family, call me immediately." I stepped into the bathroom, closed the door, and dialed. She answered on the third ring. "June," she said, surprised. "It's been a while." "Yes," I replied quietly, "and I need your help." I didn't explain everything over the phone. I didn't need to. I just said one sentence. "My daughter and her husband are talking about guardianship." There was a pause. Then her voice hardened. "I'll clear my schedule when you get home," she said. "Until then, do not sign anything, do not agree to anything, and do not let them rush you." I felt my shoulders relax for the first time since arriving. I wasn't alone. That night I packed my suitcase, carefully, methodically. I left nothing behind: no documents, no medications, no personal papers. I slept in my clothes, and when morning came, I hugged my daughter goodbye. She held on a second longer than necessary. "Call me when you get home," she said. "We'll figure everything out together." I smiled. "I'm sure we will," I replied. As I pulled away from the house, one thought stayed with me. They believed silence meant surrender. What they didn't know was that silence was how I prepared for war. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove to my house slowly, deliberately, letting the familiar streets steady me. Every red light gave me time to think. Every turn reminded me of something important. I had lived independently for a long time, long enough to know when something felt wrong. And what my daughter and her husband were doing wasn't concern. It was coordination. When I got home, I didn't unpack. I made tea, sat at my kitchen table, and opened the locked drawer where I kept the documents most people forget about until it's too late. My will, my medical directives, my financial records, everything was exactly where it should be. And that's when I remembered something they clearly hadn't considered. Years earlier, long before the distance, long before the silence, I had done something quietly, responsibly, and without telling anyone. Something my daughter didn't know existed. After my husband died, I'd promised myself one thing: I would never put my future entirely in someone else's hands, not out of distrust, out of dignity. So I had worked with Elaine to put my affairs in order, properly, legally, permanently. I pulled out the folder labeled Estate and Care and opened it. Inside was the truth: a fully executed living trust. I was not only the beneficiary, I was the sole trustee. No one could make decisions for me without my consent. No one could access my assets without my signature. And no one, not my daughter, not her husband, not a court, could override it unless I was formally declared incompetent by multiple independent medical professionals. Which I wasn't, not even close. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. They were planning guardianship because they thought I was unprotected. They believed I was alone. They assumed silence meant vulnerability. What they didn't know was that I had already built a wall, quiet, legal, unmovable, years before they ever thought of crossing a line. Then I saw something else in the folder: a letter, Elaine's handwriting on the envelope. I'd forgotten about it. I opened it carefully. "June, if anyone ever pressures you to give up control for your own good, this document exists for exactly that reason. You are competent, you are protected, and you do not owe anyone access to your life just because they share your blood." I sat there for a long time after reading that, not angry, not afraid, clear. That's when I realized something else. If my daughter and her husband were already discussing guardianship, then they hadn't just been thinking about this. They had been preparing, which meant there was more I didn't know yet. And if they were documenting me, then I needed to document them. I picked up my phone and opened my notes app, and for the first time I wrote down everything: dates, Conversations, exact words. Including the one I was never meant to hear. She won't suspect anything. I saved the note, backed it up. Then I called Elaine again. This time I didn't just ask for advice. I asked for action because now I knew the truth. I wasn't reacting to a misunderstanding. I was protecting myself from a plan, and the next move wouldn't be emotional. It would be deliberate. Elaine didn't waste time. 2 days after I got home, I was sitting across from her in her office, a quiet space with thick walls and no windows facing the street. The kind of place where people speak freely because they know they're protected. I told her everything, not just what was said, but how it was said. The timing, the coordination, the confidence. Elaine listened without interrupting, her pen moving steadily across her legal pad. When I finished, she looked up at me and said something that made my stomach drop. They wouldn't jump straight to guardianship unless they were desperate. Desperate people don't plan holidays. They plan exits. Elaine leaned back in her chair. If they're trying to gain control of you, she said, it's usually because they've lost control somewhere else. I felt a chill. Control of what? I asked. Money, she replied calmly. Debt. Risk, exposure. At her recommendation, I authorized a background and financial inquiry. Nothing invasive. Nothing illegal, just enough to understand what kind of pressure my daughter and her husband were under. It took less than a week. And when Elaine called me back into her office, her expression told me everything before she said a word. They're in trouble, she said, not small trouble, serious trouble. My daughter's husband had taken out multiple personal loans over the past 18 months. High-interest ones. The kind you take when banks stop answering your calls. There were maxed-out credit cards, missed payments. A pending notice from their mortgage lender. They were behind, not by weeks, by months, but that wasn't the worst part. Elaine slid a document across the desk toward me. He co-signed a business venture with a friend, she said. It failed badly. The liability hadn't fully surfaced yet, but when it did, it would wipe them out. I stared at the paper, my hands steady but my chest tight. That's why, I said quietly. Elaine nodded. They don't need your help, she replied. They need your authority. Everything suddenly made sense. The sudden warmth, the rehearsed concern, the rush to label me vulnerable. They weren't trying to take care of me. They were trying to use me as a shield, a legal shortcut. If they controlled my assets, their problems disappeared. And your daughter? I asked. Elaine hesitated. She's not innocent, she said carefully. But she's not leading this. That hurt more than I expected. She knows, Elaine continued, and she's allowing it. I closed my eyes for a moment. That was worse. She's scared, Elaine added. Scared of losing her home, her lifestyle. Her stability, at the cost of mine. Elaine folded her hands. June, if they move forward with this, they'll paint you as confused, resistant, uncooperative. I nodded. I know, and once that narrative starts, she said, it's hard to stop. I looked up at her. Then we stop it first. Elaine smiled slightly. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, because now I understood the truth. Christmas wasn't about reconciliation. It was about timing. They needed me present, compliant, documented. They needed a story, and they almost got one. Almost. I didn't confront them right away. That was intentional. People reveal the most when they believe they're still in control. So instead of pulling away, instead of growing distant, I did the opposite. I called my daughter. I've been thinking about what you said, I told her gently. About guardianship, about planning ahead. There was a pause, then relief rushed through the line. I'm so glad, she said quickly. I was worried you'd take it the wrong way. I just want to understand everything properly, I replied. Maybe we can talk it through together? Her husband joined the call without her even asking. That told me everything. They suggested a video call to explain things clearly. I agreed. Elaine was sitting beside me, just out of frame. They didn't know that. My daughter smiled when she appeared on the screen. The same warm smile she'd practiced all Christmas. Her husband leaned back confidently, arms crossed. We just want transparency, he said, so no one feels blindsided later. Later, I nodded. That sounds reasonable. They began slowly, talking about safety, about aging, about how hard it would be for them if something happened to me suddenly. Not once did they ask how I felt. Not once did they ask what I wanted. They spoke as if decisions had already been made. Guardianship would just make things easier, her husband said calmly. Fewer complications, less paperwork. For who? I asked. They both hesitated. For everyone, my daughter replied. I smiled. I had a question, I said casually. If guardianship is about protecting me, why did you start talking to a lawyer before talking to me? Silence. Her husband cleared his throat. We didn't want to worry you. By planning to take control of my life, I asked softly. My daughter's smile faltered. And another thing, I continued. You mentioned finances at Christmas. Why? Her husband answered quickly. Just making sure everything's in order. I nodded again. Good, I said, because mine already is. I leaned slightly forward. I have a living trust, I said calmly. I'm the sole trustee. No one can access my assets without my consent. My daughter froze. Her husband blinked. I've also documented everything you said over Christmas, I added, including the conversation I overheard that night. The color drained from my daughter's face. What conversation? She asked, her voice suddenly tight. I repeated it word for word. She won't suspect anything. We just need to get through Christmas. Her husband's jaw clenched. That was taken out of context, he said sharply. Then explain the context, I replied. He couldn't. And one more thing, I said quietly. I'm aware of the loans, the missed payments, the business liability. That's when everything changed. The confidence vanished. My daughter's eyes filled with tears. Her husband leaned forward, suddenly defensive. You had no right. I had every right, I interrupted calmly, to protect myself. The silence stretched, then my daughter spoke. We were just trying to survive, she whispered. At my expense, I said. She looked down. Elaine finally spoke, stepping into frame. I'm June's attorney, she said evenly, and any attempt to pursue guardianship under false pretenses would be challenged aggressively. Her husband's face went pale. I'm not here to punish you, I said, but I am here to be very clear. I held their gaze. You will not control my life. You will not access my assets. And if you attempt to misrepresent my competence again, the consequences will be legal. No shouting. No threats, just truth. When the call ended, I sat back in my chair and exhaled. For the first time since Christmas, I felt calm, because the confrontation wasn't about winning. It was about reclaiming myself. The fallout didn't happen all at once. It never does. Consequences rarely arrive dramatically. They arrive quietly, methodically, one door closing at a time. For a week after the video call, there was silence. No messages, no apologies. No explanations. That silence told me everything. They weren't regrouping emotionally, they were regrouping strategically. Elaine warned me to expect escalation. People who lose control don't usually accept it gracefully, she said. They look for leverage. She was right. 10 days later, Elaine received a notice. My daughter and her husband had consulted another attorney. They weren't filing for guardianship, not yet. Instead, they were requesting a formal assessment of my cognitive health. Voluntary on paper, strategic in reality. Elaine smiled when she read it. This is where they overplay their hand, she said. Within 48 hours, we responded. Firmly, professionally, we submitted letters from my primary care physician, cognitive screening results, statements from my financial advisor, proof of independent living and financial management. Elaine included a final paragraph. Short, sharp, unforgiving. Any further attempts to question Mrs. Harris's competence without new medical evidence will be considered harassment and met with legal action. That ended it, or so I thought. A month later, the real consequences began, not because I pushed, because pressure reveals cracks. My daughter's husband lost his job. Officially, it was restructuring. Unofficially, his financial entanglements had finally reached his employer. The loans, the failed venture, the liability he'd been hiding. When someone is desperate enough to target their own mother-in-law, they're rarely clean elsewhere. Their mortgage went into default shortly after. They sold the house quietly. No announcements, no celebration, just a for sale sign that vanished as quickly as it appeared. They moved into a smaller place across town, a rental. My daughter called me once. Her voice was tired, not angry, not accusing. Just empty. We didn't think it would turn out like this, she said. I know, I replied. That was all. Elaine asked me if I wanted to pursue further action. I didn't need to. Reality had already done the work for me. The hardest part wasn't watching their lives change. It was accepting that my daughter had been willing to trade my independence for her comfort. That knowledge doesn't fade, but it does settle. What they lost wasn't just money or stability. They lost access to me, to my trust, to the assumption that love means surrender. And for the first time in years, I felt something unexpected. Relief, because consequences don't always look like punishment. Sometimes they look like freedom. I didn't rebuild my life dramatically. There was no big declaration, no new me moment. I rebuilt it quietly, the way people do when they finally stop waiting for permission. The first thing I changed was my calendar. For years, my weeks had been shaped around availability. Was my daughter free? Did she need help? Would it inconvenience anyone if I made plans? I erased all of that. I signed up for things I'd postponed for years. A watercolor class at the community center, a Wednesday morning walking group, a local history lecture series I'd always been too busy to attend. Busy waiting, it turns out. I redecorated the guest room, not for visitors. For myself, I turned it into a reading room, soft chair, warm lamp, books stacked without apology. For the first time in a long time, my home reflected me, not who I might need to accommodate someday. I also made a decision, Elaine, called emotionally strategic. I rewrote my will, not out of anger, out of clarity. I allocated my estate deliberately, charities I believed in, a scholarship fund, organizations that helped seniors maintain independence. And yes, my daughter was still included, but not as an assumption, as a choice, a limited one, because inheritance should never be a reward for proximity. It should be an extension of values. People noticed the change before I named it. "You seem lighter," my neighbor said one afternoon. I was, because I'd stopped carrying the weight of proving my worth. The phone calls from my daughter became less frequent. When they came, they were careful, polite, measured. She never apologized, not directly, but she stopped asking questions about my finances. She stopped suggesting options. She stopped implying concern that sounded like preparation. That told me more than words ever could. One evening, months later, I sat on my porch watching snow settle quietly on the railing. Christmas lights glowed in the distance. And for the first time in 6 years, I didn't feel hollow. I realized something important. Loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about being surrounded by people who don't see you. I still love my daughter, that didn't vanish, but love no longer meant access, or entitlement, or silence in exchange for belonging. I learned that boundaries don't push people away. They reveal who was only close because you had none. So if you're listening to this and something in my story feels uncomfortably familiar, if someone suddenly reconnected with conditions, if concern feels like control, if love arrives carrying paperwork, please hear this. You are not difficult. You are not selfish. You are not paranoid. You are paying attention. And that might be the bravest thing you ever do, because sometimes the greatest gift you give yourself isn't reconciliation. It's sovereignty and peace, and a life that belongs fully to you. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated, tell me in the comments. And remember, you don't owe anyone access to your life just because they share your blood. You owe yourself the truth.